What if I told you that, once upon a time, the United States government planned to attack itself? Sounds impossible, right? But this isn't a movie plot or some wild internet rumor. This was a real plan written, discussed, and officially proposed by top U.S. military leaders. It was called Operation Northwoods, and its goal was shocking: to stage fake terrorist attacks against American citizens, and then blame them on another country. Yes, the plan involved pretending that innocent Americans had died, all to justify a new war. In this video you'll discover how and why America's own defense chiefs came up with such an unbelievable idea, who stopped it before it could happen, and what this dark moment reveals about fear, power, and control during the Cold War. Stick around till the end, because the truth about Operation Northwoods isn't just history, it's a lesson about how far governments might go when they believe the end justifies the means. To understand why something as shocking as Operation Northwoods was ever imagined, we need to go back to the early 1960s, a time when the world stood on edge. The Cold War wasn't just about politics. It was about survival. Every decision, every move felt like it could decide the future of humanity. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a silent, dangerous struggle for power. Both had nuclear weapons. Both wanted to prove that their way of life, democracy or communism, was the one that would rule the world. One wrong step could start a war that no one would survive. And then, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, something happened that terrified Washington. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the Cuban government and declared his island a communist state. Suddenly, the Soviet Union had a new friend, right next door to America. For U.S. leaders, that was unacceptable. Imagine the tension. An enemy base practically in your backyard. American generals and politicians saw Cuba as a ticking time bomb. They believed that if the U.S. didn't act fast, communism would spread across Latin America. The fear was real. And it grew with every passing day. In 1961, the CIA tried to solve the Cuba problem with a secret invasion, the Bay of Pigs. But the mission was a disaster. Cuban forces crushed the invasion in days. The world saw it. The United States looked weak. President John F. Kennedy was embarrassed. And the Pentagon was furious. Inside the military, frustration turned into obsession. They wanted revenge. They wanted another chance to take down Castro, but this time they needed public support. They couldn't just attack Cuba out of nowhere. They needed a reason that the American people would believe. And so, deep inside the Pentagon, planners began thinking the unthinkable. What if they could create that reason? What if the U.S. could make it look like Cuba had attacked first? That's when Operation Northwoods was born, a plan so secret, so extreme, that it would blur the line between defense and deception. After the humiliating failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion, the atmosphere in Washington was electric with frustration. The United States had tried to remove Fidel Castro. But instead, it had handed him a victory. The Cuban Revolution looked stronger than ever. And America looked powerless. Inside the Pentagon and the CIA, that defeat burned like a wound. The military elite believed Castro's success wasn't just a Cuban win, it was a Soviet triumph. And in the world of the Cold War, losing ground to the Soviets was unthinkable. Every general, every official felt the same silent pressure. We have to fix this. We have to hit back. But there was one massive problem: public opinion. The American people didn't want another war so soon after World War II in Korea. Congress wasn't eager either. Without a clear reason, the U.S. couldn't just invade a small island and expect the world to accept it. So, the question inside the Pentagon became darker. How do we make the public believe that Cuba is the enemy? That single question became the seed of something dangerous. The intelligence community began brainstorming ways to justify action against Cuba. At first, ideas were subtle: propaganda campaigns, small covert operations, minor acts of sabotage. But slowly the ideas evolved. The more frustrated the planners became, the more extreme their suggestions turned. They wanted something dramatic. Something that would shock Americans into supporting war. Something that would make people demand revenge. Officials began to whisper about a false attack, something that would look like an act of aggression from Cuba, even if it wasn't. If the public could be made to believe that Cuba had struck first, the government would have its justification. The logic was chilling but simple: a fake war trigger could lead to a real war victory. Within this mindset of fear and desperation, boundaries began to disappear. The idea of lying to the public didn't seem outrageous anymore. It seemed strategic. And from that mindset, from paranoia, humiliation, and the hunger to win, came one of the most disturbing proposals in American military history. Operation Northwoods was about to take shape. In 1962, some of America's top military leaders drew up a plan that reads like a dark thought experiment. They called it Operation Northwoods. The document came from the Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was a list of ideas. The ideas were meant to create a reason to attack Cuba. Many were shocking to read even then. The plan suggested staging incidents that would look like Cuban aggression. It proposed false reports of attacks on U.S. targets. It talked about making it appear that Americans had been killed by Cuban forces. Some proposals involved hijacking planes and claiming Cuban responsibility. Others suggested sinking ships and blaming Cuba. The planners even wrote about using Cuban exile groups to carry out staged acts. They imagined fake bombings and phony sabotage. They suggested creating believable evidence to point the finger at Havana. The memo named specific, dramatic actions meant to stir outrage. The goal was clear: make the nation demand a response. The military writers argued that a shocked and angry public would support force against Castro. That would give the Kennedy administration political cover to act. Reading the plan, you can feel how calm, clinical language hid a violent intent. The document treated lies and deception as tools of policy. It assumed the public could be persuaded by staged events. It treated the truth as flexible if the end was removing a threat. Importantly, this plan never became policy. It was a proposal. It was debated inside the Pentagon. But the idea that top officers would write, sign, and pass around such options is what stunned people when the papers were later revealed. The existence of the memo showed how fear and frustration can push planners toward extreme ideas. It exposed a readiness to use deception as a weapon. That is why Operation Northwoods remains one of the most disturbing chapters of Cold War thinking. At its heart, Operation Northwoods was a plan about one thing: creating a reason. The military leaders who wrote it believed they needed a clear, dramatic excuse to act against Cuba. They thought that without an obvious provocation, the American public and Congress would not support a full-scale intervention. So they sketched ways to manufacture that provocation. The cold logic is easy to describe and hard to stomach. If people saw Americans killed or attacked, they would demand action. Anger would replace doubt. Calls for revenge would drown out restraint. That shift in feeling would give leaders political cover. It would let them move from secret plotting to open war. The plan also revealed another idea: that deception can be a tool of statecraft. Planners treated fake attacks and false evidence as techniques. They assumed careful staging could point blame at Cuba. They believed the media, the public, and even foreign governments could be persuaded. They counted on a chain reaction: staged incident, public outrage, political mandate, military action. There was also a strategic aim. Military leaders saw Castro as a Soviet foothold in the Western Hemisphere. They viewed his regime as a direct threat to U.S. security. For them, removing Castro was not optional. It was urgent. They judged that the risk of not acting outweighed the moral cost of deception. In their minds, the ends justified extreme means. But the plan also assumed something about people: that truth could be shaped. It assumed citizens would accept official accounts without deep skepticism. It assumed key institutions would not demand full proof. Those assumptions carried moral weight. They reduced real human lives to instruments of policy. They treated funerals and fear as levers to pull. When you read the plan, you see both strategy and hubris. You see a government under pressure. You see leaders willing to test ethical boundaries. And you see a dangerous belief that in a crisis the state can rewrite truth to protect itself. Operation Northwoods was never carried out. But its purpose, to make war seem necessary by manufacturing outrage, remains a powerful warning. When the Joint Chiefs sent their proposals up the chain, the plan reached the desk of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The memo was detailed. It was signed and dated. It named specific pretexts and dramatic actions meant to point the finger at Cuba. The reaction from the White House was swift and firm. President John F. Kennedy read the proposals and rejected them. He refused to authorize false attacks on American soil to create a pretext for war. Kennedy made it clear he would not turn the lives of U.S. citizens into tools for a political goal. The rejection strained relationships at the top. General Lyman Lemnitzer, who had signed the memo as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, found himself out of favor. Within months he was reassigned to a NATO post. Historians see that move as a sign that the president did not accept the direction some military leaders were pushing. It's important to be precise here. The plan never became official policy. None of the shocking actions in the memo were carried out. Still, the fact that such measures were formally proposed by senior military leaders shook people when the documents later came to light. The proposal itself exposed how far some officials were willing to go in the name of national security. Kennedy's rejection ended Northwoods before it began. But the episode left a mark. It showed a clash between military urgency and civilian oversight. It also revealed a dangerous willingness to consider deception as a tool of statecraft. That tension would echo through later debates about secrecy, trust, and power. For more than 30 years, Operation Northwoods remained buried in secrecy. The plan sat locked away in classified archives, known only to a handful of insiders. It was never spoken of publicly, never mentioned in the press, and never taught in history books. To the outside world it simply didn't exist. Then, in the 1990s, something unexpected happened. A wave of declassifications followed the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Review Act. The government began releasing thousands of Cold War-era documents. Among them was a file with a bland title, but inside, historians found something astonishing: the full text of Operation Northwoods. The discovery was like uncovering a ghost story hidden inside official paperwork. The document wasn't rumor or speculation, it was typed, signed, and real. It described in calm, bureaucratic language a series of false attacks on Americans and U.S. property, all to justify war against Cuba. When journalists and researchers first read it, many thought it had to be a misunderstanding. But it wasn't. The plan had gone all the way up the chain of command in 1962. It had been seriously considered by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The realization hit hard. This wasn't a conspiracy theory, this was American history. The revelation sent shockwaves through the public. People asked how such an idea could have been written in an official document. What did it say about power, fear, and moral limits during the Cold War? For many, it became a symbol of how far governments might go when they feel threatened, how easily truth can be bent in the name of national security. Even though Operation Northwoods was never executed, its exposure reshaped how people viewed official narratives. It fueled debates about transparency, trust, and accountability. The plan that once lived in darkness became a reminder that democracy depends on knowing what happens behind closed doors. The story of Operation Northwoods wasn't over when it was buried, it began when it was revealed. The story of Operation Northwoods isn't just about a plan that never happened. It's about what the plan reveals. It shows how fear can twist logic, how power can blur moral lines, and how even in a democracy, secrecy can hide disturbing ideas. In the early 1960s, the United States saw itself as the defender of freedom against communism. Yet behind closed doors, some of its own leaders considered sacrificing truth, and even innocent lives, to protect that freedom. That contradiction still echoes today. How far should a government go in the name of national security? Where does protection end and manipulation begin? When Operation Northwoods was made public decades later, it shattered a quiet illusion. Many people realize for the first time that not every government plan is guided by clear morality. Even though the plan was never approved, the fact that it was written, signed, and seriously discussed was enough to erode trust. It became a key example in debates about false flag operations, events staged to deceive the public and justify political or military action. Over time, the term false flag entered popular culture and conspiracy theories. But unlike many rumors, Northwoods was documented reality. That's what made it so unsettling. It showed that deception wasn't just possible, it was planned. For historians, Northwoods stands as a warning. It reflects the intense paranoia of the Cold War, a time when the fear of losing to the Soviet Union drove extreme thinking. For ordinary citizens, it's a lesson about the value of transparency and skepticism. It reminds us that power, when unchecked, can drift into dangerous territory. That's why civilian oversight, like President Kennedy's rejection, matters. It draws the line between what can be done and what should be done. Operation Northwoods may have stayed buried for decades, but its impact didn't fade. It continues to challenge how we think about loyalty, truth, and control. Because in the end, it's not just a story about America's past, it's a mirror reflecting the choices every powerful nation must face. Operation Northwoods stands as one of the most unsettling what-ifs in American history. Never happened. But it almost did. And sometimes, what almost happened says more about a nation than what actually does. The plan showed how fear can drive even the most powerful institutions to the edge of reason. It revealed that when leaders feel cornered, they may start to see deception as strategy, and truth as an obstacle. That's the danger of fear, it justifies the unthinkable. But Operation Northwoods also showed something else, the power of restraint. President Kennedy's rejection of the plan was more than a political decision. It was a moral one. It reminded the world that even in the darkest moments of the Cold War, someone at the top was willing to say no. That refusal protected not just America's image, but its soul. When the plan was finally exposed decades later, it forced the public to confront uncomfortable questions. How much do we really know about what happens behind closed doors? Can we trust governments to always do what's right, especially in times of fear? Those questions still matter, maybe even more today. Operation Northwoods serves as a warning, not only to Americans, but to every country that faces the temptation to sacrifice truth for control. It reminds us that democracy depends on transparency, and that real strength lies not in manipulation, and in honesty. In the end, this story isn't just about a secret plan from the past. It's about the thin line between protection and deception, between patriotism and paranoia. And perhaps the most chilling part is this: Operation Northwoods never happened, but the fact that it was even written means it could happen again, somewhere, sometime, under different names, in different forms. Because history doesn't always repeat itself. Sometimes, it just waits for the right moment to be rewritten. If you found this story eye-opening, make sure you don't let it slip away. Hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell. There are more hidden chapters of history waiting to be uncovered. Drop a comment below. Do you think a plan like Operation Northwoods could ever happen again? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you learned something new today, give this video a like. It helps the channel reach more curious minds who love history that feels stranger than fiction. Thanks for watching till the end. Stay curious, stay questioning. And remember, the truth is never lost, it's just waiting to be found.